Hello everyone, I'm Cient here, and today I want to talk about a topic that I heard described as True Wars 2 by WoodenPotatoes. He released a video about this, I guess a couple months ago now at this point. This is the idea of thinking about what sort of game would, the person discussing the particular topic, so it's going to differ for each individual, have liked Guild Wars 2 to have been. Or, put another way, Guild Wars 2, while it carries on a lot of the lore elements of Guild Wars 1, does not mechanically relate that closely to Guild Wars 1. There are a ton of changes and a ton of differences, and not everybody's happy with those changes. For me personally, I am mostly unhappy with a lot of the mechanical changes. I feel personally that they either went too far or not far enough, depending upon the way that I look at it. And I think that this is an interesting topic to examine, because what it does is it forces us to confront, in many regards, what it is that we like about a game experience and what we want from it. So, for me, the highlights of Guild Wars 1 are sort of the build system and the way that plays out. And that got dramatically changed in Guild Wars 2. I think that, and this is probably going to be a little bit of a combination of critique of Guild Wars 2 as well as like what I would have liked personally in a sequel. My biggest critique of Guild Wars 2, hands down, is that I find the combat to get boring after a while with regular enemies. And there might be some bosses that are more engaging, but if the meat and potatoes gameplay of just confronting normal enemies is something that I find tedious and unfun, then the experience is unfun overall. And it's unfortunate because I really like a lot about the game. I really like a lot of the visual style, and the character creator is super awesome and stuff that way. But I really... one of the things that I liked about Guild Wars 1 is the way that enemies use the exact same skill system that players do. It made them able to kind of operate in a system where they were more engaging. And I just feel like a lot of the enemies in Guild Wars 2, you just kind of confront the same way for standard enemies, and it's pretty dull and monotonous to me. But that's where I say I kind of feel like it either went too far from straying from Guild Wars 1 or didn't go far enough. So, for me personally, what I think is more interesting to discuss is what sort of carries on the mechanical spirit of Guild Wars 1. In some regards, it's kind of a spiritual successor sort of question, sort of Dark Souls to Demon Souls, where what makes something a spiritual successor? And for me, Guild Wars 2 isn't a mechanical sequel of Guild Wars 1 at all, because the mechanics are so fundamentally changed. So it's interesting then of what are the things that to me are key elements of the Guild Wars 1 experience that I would want to see duplicated in a sequel. And there's a couple of them. But like I said, the build system and the way that sort of combat played out are big ones. Now, I don't object to things like having jumping or a little bit more movement or having a proper vertical axis or anything like that. Those, I think, are positive changes. But the things that I particularly liked are stuff to do with the skills and the builds and the way that enemies use the same sort of skills, and there was a sort of pacing to the play as well. So some of the fundamental changes that they made to move more action, they got rid of things like the energy, which I think is an important part of pacing combat, is the energy regeneration rate. And let's see, so what's a good way to kind of get in here succinctly? So there's some things that were not important to me in Guild Wars 1. So, for example, the online play aspect, which is kind of the idea of what MMO is about. I liked the way that Guild Wars 1 did it with the heavy instancing. I don't really need that much of an online play experience. It's really cool to be able to team up with friends and play with them. But I'm also mostly content to play the game with heroes. And that, to me, like, I would be happy with an offline version of Guild Wars 1. And especially if it had mod support, that'd be amazing. So I don't actually like the persistent world. So there's some important things here. So I don't like the waypoint system for fast travel, because I feel that it has a couple of major downsides. And one of them is that there's no natural hub gathering points for players. If you're going to have that, like, I like the delineation between this is a hub area for players to gather, where stores and stuff are, and is a safe space. where enemies can't be because it's a non-combat zone, and then the explorable areas or missions where there's combat. And I like that separation and that segregation. And I do like the way that can cause players to gather in specific locations. But I also like it's kind of weird. So they talk about there being the persistent world with Guild Wars 2 and that. But it's so less permanent feeling to me than the explorable zones. Because in the persistent world, what's persisting is sort of the player's presence, but everything around the world has to reset. So that way when a player is in that area, they can experience everything. They can experience the enemies. They can experience the dynamic events, which I think is a really cool system. But they can experience all of these things, and so the zones have to be very static in many regards. They cannot change that much. You cannot have all of the enemies be dead or something like that. So Guild Wars 1 allows zones to be able to change as you're going through them, and that change stays in different ways. So here's a couple of examples. When you're just going through the zone, and this is just kind of normal while you're in the instance, when you kill an enemy, it stays dead. More enemies don't spawn unless they're like specific spawn-ins, but you know what I mean. It's like you don't get more enemies spawn. Once you've exhausted all the enemies in the map, they're exhausted, they're gone, and there's not any more. You can clear out a zone in this way, and it makes a sense that you've gone through it and you've done something. The others, though, is a very interesting one. Because it's instanced, they can actually change what spawns in that zone when you go into it. So, for example, in the War in Kryta content, or Winds of Change is even a better example. In Winds of Change, you go through and you kill all of the afflicted enemies. And what happens is the mobs that spawn are actually different in those zones quasi-permanently. You can take a quest to change them back, but on kind of a quasi-permanent status, effectively sort of permanent, but slightly reversible, the enemies that you encounter in the zones are different. They have changed and they have become something different. And that is a significant thing that you can do because it's instanced, that you can't really do in a persistent world. Like if you change it in the persistent world, it changes for everyone. There might be some ways of doing some shenanigans to kind of get around that, but it's just that ability to actually have the world sort of change in response to what the player has done. I think the instanced version allows you to do that in a way that a persistent version doesn't really, and I think that's kind of an interesting contrast. So that's something that I actually like about Guild Wars 1. I like the instanced nature of it. I like the sort of personal nature of it. And the sense of the world is different as a result as well. It feels more personal when it's instanced because it is a personal zone. But the other thing, as to get back to waypoints, is from a design standpoint, I feel like the waypoints make it so that way zones themselves function in an unpredictable way in terms of how the player is approaching it. So what I mean by that is in Guild Wars 1 you have zone transitions, right? These zone portals. And there's a definite number of them, a limited number of them on any given map, and they're much more limited than the number of waypoints. So when you enter a map, there's very discrete locations that you can be entering it from, and it's usually going to be from an edge of the map, or in some cases kind of like from the middle of it in like the Unwaking Waters area, for example, in factions. But because the designers know where you're entering the map from, they can design the map based upon those sorts of directions of travel that you're going to be taking through it. And they can kind of make sure that there's sort of an interesting arrangement of things and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of an interesting and valuable thing to be able to have. But it also means that knowing how to get through a map has a little bit more value to it, if that makes sense. And there's a skill of navigation where you're not just going from a specific waypoint. Basically what I'm saying is I feel like the number of waypoints in Guild Wars 2 has a negative impact on maps and sort of the feel of the space and things like that. But anyway, what I feel is perhaps the most significant thing to me, and I've said it before, and I know this is a bit scatterbrained, is that I really like the way that Guild Wars 1 runs its builds. So, as well as its character progression. So for those who haven't played it, the primary form of character progression in Guild Wars 1 is acquiring skills to open up more builds. Now this is where I would get a little bit critical in that I think there are too many skills in Guild Wars 1. And what I mean by that is you have too much redundancy of skills in a way where competitionally between skills, there's going to be sort of a best option. So, for example, if you look at Paragon Spear attacks, there's a handful of them that all are conditional deep wound inflictors. So it's like this one costs some energy, and if it's a crit, then it inflicts a deep wound. And this one inflicts a deep wound if they're below 50% health. And this one inflicts a deep wound if they're stationary. And this one inflicts a deep wound under some other circumstance, right? And so you have a number of different circumstances under which these different skills inflict a deep wound. And so which one's going to be the most reliable way of inflicting a deep wound? It's probably not the one that requires a critical hit to do it. Although Go for the Eyes can kind of get you around that a little bit. But there's this issue where what purpose are all these different skills performing? Is there... It's a sort of false sense of variety. Basically, what I'd want to do is have fewer skills where each skill is a meaningful choice, if that makes sense. Where there aren't just skills that you kind of are like, yep, that's a skill, and just gloss over it. Because, for example, Fireball and Liquid Fire are very redundant in their functionality. And it's not to say that there isn't something... or it's not to say that a little bit of redundancy is a bad thing. And I do think it's nice to have some sort of cross-performing skills. For example, a skill that works better in a certain sort of build than in another variant works a little better in another sort of build, or where you might want two copies of the same skill. But there's a number of skills where it's just like, okay, I don't bring this because these other skills are generally preferable to it most of the time, and therefore I have no reason to use these other skills. It's kind of the filler card problem in like Magic the Gathering, for example, where they have to make so many cards for various reasons, and then you run into filler that doesn't really, like, it can't compete competitively at the higher ends of competition, or even at the mid ends of competition, where it requires some sort of limited pool to actually be useful or be worth using. And I don't mind a few of those here and there early on, but honestly, I think it's better to have a discrete set of these are sort of the top skills and not worry too much about having too many skills. The other thing that I definitely like is I do like the dual profession system. This certainly can make some aspects and elements of balancing more difficult, but I think it's more interesting and allows for some very interesting ways of engaging with options. It allows you to be able to be more explorative and more creative because it opens up more possibilities. I do think a more limited skill pool would help with some of the potential brokenness that can happen with this if something is too powerful of a combination. I do think a lot of care needs to be taken to ensure that this system has value and isn't just making things ridiculous in some regards. But the value of creativity that it opens up, I think, is worth having to go through some of that. I would say also, because ArenaNet did a lot to try to combat some of the most abusive cross-profession combinations, that sometimes that is something that can be addressed in less heavy-handed ways. Speaking of which, there are also serious problems. Now, I like the elite skill system that they have in Guild Wars 1, where elite skills are kind of analogous to like rare cards or something. They're either a souped-up version of a normal skill, or there's some combination of skills that's really nice for saving you skill slots and stuff like that, or just have unique build-around effects. But there are some elites that I really question the existence of, like Withdraw Hexes, for example. It's a perfect example of an elite skill that doesn't serve any purpose. So with a fewer number of skills, you can definitely focus to make sure that the skills you are including do something and are worth using. So for me, the biggest issue is the number of skills in Guild Wars 1 is greater than is balanceable. Like, you cannot have that many skills all be simultaneously good. The other big issue, actually, is that you also want to make sure that skills that seem overtly powerful are actually powerful. So there's this conundrum you can walk into with these sorts of systems, which is where there's stuff that looks weak but is actually strong. There's stuff that looks weak and is actually weak. There's stuff that looks okay but is actually weak. And then there's stuff that looks good and is actually good, and stuff that looks good and is actually bad. And the thing that you want to be careful of is you want to avoid sort of beginner player traps. So a really good example of this is Heal Other, or Jamie's Gaze if you prefer the factions equivalent. That skill had no business being doubled up, but this is a skill that looks like it's pretty solid. It can't heal yourself, but you can heal one of your allies for a big chunk of health. This is important because healing your ally for a big chunk of health helps them stay alive. The problem is this skill costs 10 energy, and it's just not worth 10 energy. It's worth maybe 6 or 7. Not 5. It's too strong for 5, but it's definitely not worth 10 energy. But it looks like it's such a strong skill for the amount it heals. It's just the rate is not good enough. So new players will use this skill on their monks, and then their monks will run out of energy and can't heal them because they've brought an incredibly inefficient skill with them. And this is the sort of trap that I'm talking about, where the skill looks like it's really good, but it's actually, not only is it not good, it's actually detrimental. It's a bad skill. And that sort of thing needs to be very carefully weeded out, because that's the case you don't want to have. It's okay if there's skills that look okay to a new player or that they're kind of excited about but aren't really that great. It's just the ones that actually look like they're really strong need to be really strong. So you need your jumps for magic reference, but you also need to make sure that your dragon is actually a powerful card if you actually get it down. So that's something that I think is really important. The skill acquisition of getting skills from skill quests I think is really cool because it encourages you to experiment with builds. I'm kind of sad that they abandoned that with the later installments in the game and just relied on skill trainers. Although finding a skill trainer that teaches you a skill that you couldn't previously access is also really cool. So I think some combination of that is good. And I really like the skill capturing system. I think that that's fantastic. I also really like the way that party composition works because of the limited skill bar and the way that you'd need to team up with people to try to get full functionality usually. That system I think works really well, and I personally enjoy it, but it works best because heroes exist or henchmen exist, so you don't have to team up with other players. You can fill out your party. This is again where it goes back to, I don't need this to be an online game. I just really like the core mechanical functionality of team composition and building builds and the way the attribute system works as well, which I should probably get into in a moment, because that system allows you to experiment with things, put together builds, figure out what works, but also there's an importance to having separate roles for everyone, and that it makes diversity of functionality important. So what I mean is, if the enemy has a strong healer, or perhaps a strong nuker, for example, an elementalist, say, with like Meteor Shower and... I mean, Meteor Shower's kind of... But like Meteor Shower and Fireball and Rodgort's Invocation and like Mind... Is it Mind Spark? Whatever. The Fire Mind spell. These really powerful area of effect spells, you can specifically be like, okay, I need to shut that down because it's going to overwhelm my healing. And you have specific roles that way. Or like, this thing is harassing my backline, I need to try to protect them. And you have specific things that you can try to do that. And so because there's a variety of ways in which different roles are required to be able to fulfill different things, there's variety in how you approach the enemies. You need to strategize at least some. Usually or especially with the later stuff where they actually kind of built parties that do anything. A lot of the base enemies from the vanilla experiences, non-hard mode, non-like Winds of Change type content, are a little too similar. So there's not quite as much depth there as there ideally needs to be. And this goes to one of my complaints about Guild Wars 2, which is that the enemies aren't interesting to fight, and that's because you approach every single standard enemy the same way, which is attack it until it's dead and don't let it kill you, basically. And that can absolutely work in something where the way that you do that is interesting and engaging, like Dark Souls or Shadow of War. But the problem is, in sort of the format that they have, it's just auto attack and use your damage dealing skills when they're off cooldown, and dodge and heal as needed. And I just find that becomes so formulaic that the way that you approach every enemy in Guild Wars 2 just becomes too samey. Whereas in Guild Wars 1, at least when things are built better with some of the higher end content, you have to figure out what enemies are the threat. You have to do some serious threat assessment. Which ones are actually the threat? Which ones are actually causing me the most problems? What enemies can I just kind of ignore for now? Or what enemies do I need to prioritize? And what's going on in this specific situation? What is this group composition doing? What specific enemies in this are doing something that's causing me serious problems versus which ones are kind of harassing me and distracting me? And what do I need to go at to be able to get through this mob? And so I find that there's a level of engagement that can be had with that, strategizing and trying to figure out how to prioritize things, that is much more engaging because of the different roles that are present in a party that the enemies can have as well. And I think this is really significant. Guild Wars 1 doesn't really have a tank or any of that sort of thing. There's no aggro management in that sense. But there is distinct roles that you can have in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. But not just you, the enemy has it too, and you have to understand how to interrelate with that. And trying to reduce roles like they did in Guild Wars 2 causes you to lose that form of engagement, that form of strategizing and tactics, which is really sad to me. So for me, also the attribute system, that means that you can't do everything, right? You have to pick what you're going to be good at. I really like the way that the attribute system works because it's allows you to be able to iterate and test different builds, but it also means you can't maximize everything. You have to pick your strengths. And I really appreciate that system and the way that it kind of says, okay, well, if you're going to go into swordsmanship, here's what you're going to be able to do. And if you're going to go into axe master, here's what you're going to be able to do. And I like the way that the system can push you in different directions and say, well, you can't just pick skills from every single attribute available to you and hope to be fully effective, because you are sacrificing something to do that. So I like a lot of those elements. So to me, what I'd really want, just to try to summarize things and bring things home, what I'd really like in a True Wars 2, a mechanical sequel, a spiritual successor to Guild Wars 1 in a mechanical sense, is I want a game that has the same sort of robust build system that Guild Wars 1 has, but with fewer overall skills, so that each skill can be a more meaningful skill. I would like it to have the party composition that matters and is significant for both you and the enemies. So that way engaging with the enemies is a strategic and tactical operation. You have to do the sort of threat assessment and prioritization, all that sort of stuff. And I like having the separated instance zones where you do stuff, and the hub zones, or sort of the town outposts like they did in Guild Wars 1. That, to me, really helps the experience sort of have a certain sort of feel to it, because there's a certain aspect of it's your party against the world that I really appreciate about that setup, and I also like the way that stuff can be changed with the instance zones. So those, to me, are some of the mechanical things that are really important. Just one final thing is, I really like how Guild Wars 1 focused specifically on your armors and stuff like that are goals to pursue, but don't feel like you have to grind for them per se. What I mean by that is, armor that you get that's the most expensive armor is just as effective as the stuff that you can get at the max level stuff that you can get that's the cheapest. And because of that, and same for like weapons and things like that, because of that, I feel like I have an incentive to play a game that I enjoy, but I can do it at the maximum level possible for me. And in terms of like, I don't have to spend a bunch of time grinding gear to be able to do specific pieces of content. And it's more about getting my skills together and pursuing those sorts of things. So anyway, those have been some of my thoughts. Like I said, I've not really talked about any of the lore stuff, because to me, Not that that isn't important, but that to me is something that I'm fine with what Guild Wars 2 did with it for the most part, with my one complaint being that I feel like... So I like the Prophecy story the best of the Guild Wars 1 collective stories because it specifically had an increasing scope of what you were trying to accomplish. Guild Wars 2, as well as Factions and Nightfall and Eye of the North, in my opinion, all too quickly go to the world-ending threat that you have to stop. And Guild Wars 1 started with the Char are invading our country, and then moved to we're trying to get our people out of the country that is now a wasteland. Oh no, this new country is filled with undead. We're going to try to fight that. And then there's bandits going on here. We're going to try to stop them. Oh wait, no, the bandits are actually trying to fight a resistance. And so we try to help them, and then we discover the Mersat, who are causing huge issues. And then we're like, okay, well, we need to stop that. And then we get to the Lich trying to end the world with the Titans. And there's a scope of what you're trying to accomplish that I really like in Guild Wars 1 Prophecies. And that's just kind of a storytelling preference, though. So there's that. There was one other thing that also was kind of sticking out in my brain for a moment there, but I got caught up in all the story stuff. So let's see if I can remember it. Ah, yes, I have recalled. The crafting system. I much prefer Guild Wars 1's crafting system. Guild Wars 2... So, my problems with Guild Wars 2's crafting system is that it's just overly tedious to get anything worthwhile out of it. Guild Wars 1's crafting system is... I mean, it is a crafting system, right? You take crafting materials, you yourself don't do the crafting, you take them to an NPC and you give them a fee, and then they do the crafting, as it were. But it's a crafting system. And Guild Wars 2's is just bulky, and it's very inelegant. It's very repetitive, it's very tedious, and Chef is the best of them because it's actually interesting to experiment around with what you can make in it. But the Guild Wars 1 crafting system is also, in my mind, far superior to the Guild Wars 2 crafting system because it knows what its place is, and it knows what its purpose is, and it sits in a good spot, in my opinion, in terms of importance, where it's not trying to do too much and accomplishing too little, like I feel Guild Wars 2's does. And so I definitely prefer that crafting system as well. So I think that's most of it. I really like the way that the build system works, and I mean that in a party sense as well. I think it could transition really well to other sorts of ways of working on an individual character build level as well as the party build level. I think it could make a sweet tactics game using a lot of the concepts of Guild Wars 1. I really like the way that the interrupts and all of that sort of stuff works as well, and all of that. So I could go into more depths about specifics, but I think that this has probably gone on long enough. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here, and until next time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.